Hi, and welcome to Wisconsin State and Regional Economic Trends, sponsored by Wisconsin Literacy. I am Shannon Mason-Young, the Northwest Regional Community Coordinator. And with me today is Liz Fitzpatrick, Data and Communications Manager. She's going to be working the controls this session. Wisconsin Literacy is a nonprofit statewide coalition of 70 literacy agencies. We strengthen literacy statewide through expert trainings, personalized consultations, health literacy, workforce connections, and advocacy. Just a quick housekeeping note as we get started. Throughout the presentation today, please feel free to raise your hand or put any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll answer them throughout the presentation. I am very excited today to introduce our presenter, Scott Hodek. Scott is the section chief of the Office of Economic Advisors, an office within the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development. He assists economic data users to better understand the relationships between labor markets and other economic and demographic trends. Scott has been an economist with the Department of Workforce Development since returning to his home state of Wisconsin in January 2006. Prior to this, he was a regional economist in Oregon, covering the Columbia Gorge region, and as well as marketing analyst in the private sector. Scott earned a Bachelor of Science degree in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, Blue Golds. Thank you, Scott, for joining us today, and we will hand over the controls to you to go into your presentation.
All right, thank you for that introduction. So today what I will do here is I'll be sharing my screen in a little bit, and I'll share a PowerPoint presentation that you'll have access to afterwards as well. And I did update it for some more recent data that just came out in addition. But what we'll do here is I'll talk a little bit about what the economy was doing just pre-COVID and how it's handling it, how it's been impacted now. And we'll discuss some things like unemployment rates, industries, how things are going overall, and then a little bit about what we expect to see in sort of a post-COVID world, if I can even say those words without jinxing us. I'll knock on wood. But so we'll just get started here. So first, okay, let's talk a little bit about leading indicators versus lagging indicators. So a lot of times when you hear about things like recessions or how the economy is doing, we tend to hear about jobs numbers, unemployment rates, things of that nature. Those are very good indicators of where we're at and where we've been, but they aren't the greatest indicators at where we're headed. And the reason for that is they're called lagging indicators. So by the time you've been in a recession for 6 months or so, that's when you start to see things like unemployment rates dropping or rising, or jobs numbers dropping. So it does take a little bit for those kinds of indicators to catch up, and that's why they're called lagging. Aside from the fact that some of that data, some of our jobs numbers data it's very complete. It's called the QCW. And some of that data actually lags by 6 months by itself. So we don't even have that data until 6 months after, say, an event has occurred. And you can see how that would make examining this whole pandemic impact on the economy very difficult, because we simply don't have enough actual real-time data. I can remember back in February and March when things were really, and April when things were really going on, that it was very difficult to say, well, this is what's happening, even though we knew, because we really didn't have the data to analyze and discuss. Now, that said, a lot of the data that we use commonly is would be lagging indicators, but there are some that have proven to be relatively decent at showing where we're headed. And those we call leading indicators. Some of them are pretty good at telling where we're at, and those are coincident. So some of the jobs data is actually coincident if it comes out quick enough. Unemployment rates can be kind of coincident. Aside from the fact that there is a data lag, there can also be a lag in the fact that businesses are reluctant to just let people go quickly. I mean, we know how hard it was to find talent over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And so businesses, when things take a downward turn in the economy, businesses don't just suddenly lay off. And that, again, causes those numbers to be kind of lagging. Now, leading indicators are things that they also, in addition to being a good tell at where you're going, they tend to be volatile. So you kind of have to bundle them together to get a good sense of where things are headed. Things like the average manufacturing work week, stock prices, consumer confidence, things that taken separately can be very volatile, but when put together make a decent index. And that's what this is. This is an index, the blue line there, the LEI, is an index of about 10 different indicators that have proven to be pretty good at showing where we're headed when taken together. So what I'll say about that is you can see here that these leading indicators really dropped, and so did the coincident in the first quarter of 2020, and then they've all kind of come back. And this shape is something you're going to see through this presentation a lot. Typically, recessions, like a normal recession, will have what we'll call like a U-shaped movement. You kind of see it here in this U. Here it's a very elongated V, but we would call this more like a U as well. In this case, when you see a shock type event, they tend to be a V, very sharp V. We didn't really know for sure if COVID was going to be the pandemic was going to be a V shape or a U shape, or I mean, there were thoughts that it could be W, and it's still pretty volatile. Although as we get closer and closer to more people being vaccinated, the risk of that lessens. But of course, it never entirely goes away because this is a new pandemic. It's a new thing, and we didn't really have much data to kind of predict how this was going to look. Overall, economically, I will say that we handled it better than I think most experts thought we would. But that said, it was still a very serious situation. The point of this graph here is just, if you look at this blue line, you can see that it's been going up, but it's also kind of leveled, and same with the red line. So the coincident indicators, where we're at right now, this is leveling off. Same with the leading indicators. So that was up 0.3% in December, which is not terrible, but last month it was up 0.6%, and the month before it was up higher. So it's important to note that looking at this, I think what we're seeing is a bit of a slowdown in the first quarter of 2021. Now, that said, it's still kind of up in the air what we might see throughout 2021, and we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But this is what the first blush indicators kind of show us. Stock prices are another interesting thing here as well. You can see that over time, I started using this in presentations to show this dip here. Actually it was to show this dip. And it looked very dire at the time, but I was letting everyone know, look, I mean, in the whole overall trend of, this is just the S&P 500, we're still significantly higher. The overall trend is still well upwards from where we were. And sure enough, we recovered and the trend strongly resumed upwards. Now, this is the COVID impact right here. And I think most of us sort of expected this to drop further. I mean, if you look at this isn't even back down to like 2016 levels. So it's certainly not as low as it was during the recession. There are a couple takeaways from here, and you can see where we're at right now. I mean, we're essentially more or less the highest we've ever been. And there have been some valleys during this time period, but overall the trend is still pretty strongly upwards. So if anything, it's a good reminder that even though this stock prices and the market can be a decent leading indicator, remember, they aren't the economy. This is investors putting in money and hedging bets and things of that nature. And you can have a situation where people are losing jobs, but if investors still think that the market is going to go up, then they keep investing, and this is how it reacts. I think that we see a few things here, not the least of which is that a lot of investors, I think, wish that they'd bargain shopped more in the last recession. And that was something that lasted quite a while. And they saw this impact and they figure, okay, this can't be a forever event. There will probably be a dip and there'll be a rally. And so everyone got in pretty quickly, and that rally happened very quickly, to the point where some analysts think that maybe it's even overvalued at this point. And I really don't know for sure. I mean, my instincts and tell me that my opinion would be that it's a little overvalued, but will we see a dip? I don't know. Investors just keep putting money into the markets. So there's some strength there. And it's interesting because we know that a lot of people lost their jobs, but yet the market continued to improve. If we look at unemployment rates, we're still, throughout the state, we're still fairly high. Now, these are December numbers, and generally winter are our highest rates. In fact, usually February is when we see the highest rates throughout the state. They can be very seasonal, especially in rural counties. And you see that up in this sort of northern third of the state. And the more your economy is related to things like tourism, the more weather is going to impact how your economy is doing and how many people have jobs. So generally up here, they tend to get a boost in winter as the snowmobile season picks up. So it's really interesting. If you're looking at that data, you can actually see when there hasn't been a great snowmobile season, when there hasn't been great snow, because winter is worse in terms of unemployment rates than it usually is. What I can tell you is, and we'll talk a little bit more about industries later, what I can tell you is that in general, a lot of these northern counties where the leisure and hospitality sector had a real rough go of it with COVID, a lot of the northern counties actually did pretty well. In fact, anecdotally, some counties told me they'd had the best year they'd ever had. And you'd think, well, how is that possible? And what we're seeing is just that during the pandemic, everything revolved around what was safe, or what was perceived to be safe. And being outside, camping, outdoor recreation, all those sorts of things were perceived to be safe. And as a result, a lot of people went north. And even though some of the businesses that would normally make money off that, like hotels, maybe didn't have the greatest time, others like campgrounds, I mean, many of you tried to find campgrounds during the summer, man, it was not easy. So that kind of bears that out. But overall, unemployment rates have vastly improved from where they were in around March, April. So we're getting back to normal, but we aren't there yet. So here's Wisconsin's unemployment rate by month. Now this one is seasonally adjusted. So that's something that we don't do for every county or every region. The data just, it probably isn't accurate enough to be run through another algorithm. And that's what we do with this, to kind of take some of the seasonality out of it. So looking at this, you can see that during this recession, the unemployment rate jumped, and then it did kind of stay high for a while. During this recession, it jumped quite a bit, and this last recession, and then it fell and fell and fell. And we've been seeing the lowering unemployment rates for quite a while. In fact, we'd gotten used to seeing nationally somewhere in the neighborhood of, mid to high threes or 4%, and that's incredibly low. Same with Wisconsin. We were seeing very, very low rates that we never really expected were even possible as economists. And obviously what we were seeing there is the labor crunch. We knew that baby boomers were leaving the labor force. They were the biggest generation that we've ever seen, and they had a huge impact on the labor force going into it and having a similar impact leaving it, to the point where it's become difficult if you're a business, it was becoming very difficult to fill those positions that they leave, not to mention if you wanted to expand and you needed additional talent on top of that. So it was a very difficult time labor-wise. And right here, you can see the sudden impact of the pandemic. And I mean, just look at this. We have never seen anything like this. The sudden just amount of growth in the unemployment rate was like nothing we've ever seen. I mean, last recession was nothing to sneeze at. That was a very serious time, and this kind of blew that number away. And then after, it eventually dropped again until we're down to here. So mean, moral of the story is that we're still higher than we used to be, but we're creeping back towards normal. If you look at the labor force data in general, this is just December of every year back to 1990. And you can see that typically for a long time, every year we could expect the labor force to grow, okay? And we still saw growth trends all the way into the 2000s. But then we started to see something that was unusual historically. It sort of leveled off and in some cases even declined year over year. And that's the impact of the baby boomers. Every year before that throughout history, we generally seen a growth in the labor force, and we counted on that. We knew that you could grow businesses, you could lure other businesses into the area, you could expand, because there would always be more labor. And that's just not where we've been the last, I would say even decade. Now, COVID has changed that somewhat, and we do see that unemployment is up significantly. But it's important to remember that that problem, that issue that we saw, that economic phenomena that was the baby boomers leaving the labor force, that is a long-term trend. We don't actually expect to even see some of the peaks of that until the 2020s and maybe even 2030. So I think the moral of this story here, and not to spoil some of what I was going to say about what would happen after, is that the impacts of COVID are a short-term event. We know a lot of people are out of work. We know the market will have to reabsorb them. But I can tell you that at some point here in the relatively near future, we will be right back where we were. It'll be an employees market. It will be a market with very, very high demand for talent. Unemployment claims. Now, this is actually one of the data sets we had that really could give us as close as we could get to real-time information. While we were waiting for other data sets to catch up, this was weekly. And we could see what happened here. We saw that we have two things on this graph here. The orange are initial unemployment insurance claims. So that's the first time you apply for a claim. And that's useful data to get a sense for how many people are applying in a given week. And the blue is your total weekly claims. That's your entire kind of caseload on unemployment insurance. So you can see here in Wisconsin, basically this really started to ramp up in actually early March, which is interesting because in some of the nation, we actually started to see some of these impacts in February, but they hadn't really filtered over here yet. And that again had to do with as COVID moved about the United States, as it spread, we started to see more and more impacts. So here we actually saw our biggest spike right here. And again, we never saw a spike like this during the last recession. It was nothing of this magnitude. And so that has gone down some, but you can see that initial claims are still higher than they generally are. And the same with the total weekly caseload. It was up in the 300,000s, which, again, we've just never seen a jump like that. And it has gone down since, which with the occasional bump in here. But overall, we're still in the 100,000 range, when usually we're somewhere around 50,000 or a little bit less. So I guess the point of the whole COVID trend thing here is we're past what was the worst of it for us, which was probably in March or April. And I say that with a grain of salt and knocking on wood, because who knows anything can happen. We don't know enough even now about this illness. But I can say that if trends continue as they are, this will have been our peak right here, and eventually we'll get back to normal. But it'll take a little time. Once something like this happens, an event of this magnitude, it takes time to get back to sort of business as usual. You can see that even in 2020, we've gotten back to I guess I wouldn't say close, but we have certainly improved quite a bit. But to get back to all the way back to normal will take a bit. This was total non-farm jobs in Wisconsin. This was a very telling indicator as well. You can see that even in the last recession, we definitely had a pretty significant job drop there, but it was nothing like we saw during COVID. Again, I know I keep saying that, but this movement is so unusual in all of our data. I can tell you that we lost something in the neighborhood of 450,000 jobs over the space of 1 month. We've never seen anything like it. Excuse me. And while we have gained back a significant number of those jobs, I mean, all you have to do is look at this graph to say, okay, we're over halfway back, but we're not back yet. And that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, the different data sources tell different stories. We don't know exactly the magnitude yet of how far we have to go to get back to normal, it depends on which data set you look at. But I think what we can take away from all of them is that we're not there yet. So manufacturing, this is typically an important sector for the state of Wisconsin. We have a very high concentration in manufacturing, which doesn't mean we necessarily have the most jobs in the country, but what we do have, what it means is that in terms of versus our total number of jobs, it makes up the highest percentage. So we have the highest concentration, and we typically jockey with the state of Indiana as to who's the highest. At any given time, it's one of us, and the other one is second. So I couldn't tell you right now if we're first or second, but the point being that manufacturing is very important to the state. Now, this was an incredibly interesting trend if you look at this versus some of the others. So let me go back again here. You can see in the last recessions, remember this drop absolutely dwarfed those. But if you look at manufacturing, typical recessions can be very hard on manufacturing because people stop spending, so people aren't buying consumer goods. Businesses stop a lot of their capital spending, so they aren't buying machinery, things like that. And so everyone who makes something tends to get hit pretty hard in recessions. And you can see that in this 2002, 2003 recession, manufacturing lost a lot of jobs and it sort of leveled there and they didn't come back. We were also seeing a fair amount of offshoring, of course, during that time period too. And then this last recession, again, we saw a similar drop. Now, from this one, manufacturing was coming back. So I think we hit something of a level here that was sustainable. And then we had the drop due to the pandemic. But you can see that this drop wasn't even as big a drop as the last recession or the recession prior. So manufacturing actually weathered this better than it does a usual recession and better than most industries. And in fact, it's almost back to where it was statewide. And in some regions, like having to be looking at the Eau Claire region recently, it's actually higher than it was before the pandemic hit. Now, a lot of that has to do with what you're manufacturing and the differences in this sort of pandemic shock to the economy versus a regular recession. We know that a lot of people were still spending. I think to an extent we have the stimulus to thank for that. And that's exactly when a lot of economists say government should be spending is when people need that boost. And that tends to keep the economy afloat. Sooner or later, you have to tighten the belt. But I'm of the opinion that a down market is the good time for government to actually spend, even if it means taking on debt. But paying back that debt becomes very important when the economy's booming then. And that's something that we haven't always seen a ton of. I hope we see more, but I will say that looking at this, we know that a lot of people were still spending on, they weren't necessarily going on trips. And we see that kind of impact. And instead, sometimes they were buying big ticket items where they were seeing massive sales, whether that's furniture or an appliance or a car. And we saw all kinds of incentives to make that happen. Cars were a tough one, and that industry is still down a little bit. There's still very good sales out there for that. But we also saw that there was a jump in demand for things like masks, toilet paper, inexplicably. I don't really want to get into discussion on that, but and paper towel recently was another one. So we've actually seen places like Kimberly-Clark ramping up, and I mean, they're making N95 masks now. So, and I'd heard of a business, I think it was over towards Wausau, if I remember right. And they had made some kind of sheeting upholstery for furniture, and they had switched to making masks. So it's that sort of thing that enabled manufacturing to do better here, which was a little problematic when people didn't want to work, whether everything was tied to the perception of safety. And so as a manufacturer, you had all this demand, but could you get people into work was part of kind of the difficulty there. But again, you know, this industry is almost back to where it was. Retail jobs. This was another kind of interesting one. Usually it does drop some during recessions as well, but it tends to come back, and it's very seasonal, as you can see. Obviously, these bumps here are the holiday shopping season. And you can see that it dropped pretty drastically. You know, and part of that too is that a lot of retail, I mean, they weren't sure they could be open. They're a very face-to-face oriented type of business. And we had various restrictions on how businesses could operate throughout the pandemic, and all those had an impact on this industry. But if you look now, I mean, despite the job loss here in the early stages of the pandemic, retail is pretty much back to where it was. So again, that one is pretty encouraging. Now, education and health type jobs. This is another really interesting one. I can tell you that throughout most recessions, this particular industry sees very little impact. All these gray bars here are recessions. Why is that? Well, on the education side, obviously schools are still open, but when it comes to say recent graduates or people who are losing jobs, a lot of times they think, well, now is a good time to upskill. And that's a good thought in terms of what to do during a recession. And they come out of it with higher skill levels, and rather than looking for a job when jobs are hard to find. And so education usually benefits from that. On the other side, you also have healthcare, where people will continue to make health decisions and say, well, I could put off buying a couch, but I can't put off this treatment or this testing, or et cetera, et cetera. And so healthcare is also very recession resistant, both of these two industries. Now they're taken together here, and you can actually see a drop during the early stages of the pandemic, which again, we have never seen anything like this. We remember we had nurses being off, or well, essentially to take furloughs, you know, and a lot of them did. And that's not something we've ever really seen before. I mean, part of that for healthcare was obviously people putting off non-critical health issues because they were concerned about exposure to COVID. But it also had to do with hospitals for a while canceling non-critical type health service consumption, things like that. We basically had them saying, well, we're not going to do these kinds of elective procedures right now because of exposure, possible exposure to COVID, and we might need those hospital beds, things of that nature. So healthcare, actually, we saw drop, and we actually saw something similar with education. As schools had to close, we actually see folks like lunchroom staff or janitors or any number of school associated jobs being laid off as well. So taken together, both of those actually dropped during this, and they aren't back to where they were. Now that said, they were not the industry that was hit the hardest, and I think we all kind of expected this. Leisure and hospitality. So in typical governmentese, this is named leisure and hospitality, but what this is, this includes restaurants and bars and all those kinds of establishments. It also includes hotels, a lot of the recreation like golf courses, things like that. That all falls under leisure and hospitality. And you can see that this industry, well, it did take a little bit of a hit in the last recession, and that's fairly common. This industry relies heavily on discretionary spending. So it's not surprising to see people when they start tightening the belt. Restaurants, scripts, those are kind of the first things to. But what you can see here is that it dropped just by an order of magnitude that we have never seen. I mean, look at this. This industry lost over half of its jobs in the space of 1 month. I mean, that is staggering. We've never seen anything like this. Now, a lot of those jobs have come back, but we're seeing dips again as well. And a lot of this is, it's based on the things like the perception of safety amongst consumers, but it's also based on how many of these establishments can be open and how many people they are allowed to serve at a time. There's a lot going on here, but this industry bore the brunt of what happened during this pandemic. Now, like I was mentioning earlier, this didn't hit the same everywhere. Places that were more dependent on things like business travel, your urban centers, were actually hit harder than a lot of your sort of rural areas where it was more based on tourism. Now, that said, it depended on the kind of tourism, but if you could be outside in activities that were considered relatively safe, then you actually did pretty well during the pandemic if you were in this sector. So let's talk a little bit about the future here. We expect the economy to recover, and when it does, a lot of the workforce issues that we had prior to the pandemic will be front and center again. And I haven't been hearing a lot about that, and you probably won't hear a lot about that in the news just yet. But once the vaccine starts getting widely distributed and we start looking forward again, I think you'll start to see this talent crunch that we had heard about in the news a lot be kind of front and center again in terms of policy. So what you're looking at right here is just the top 10 hot jobs statewide. And what a hot job is to us is it just has higher than average number of job openings annually and a higher than median wage. So the top job here is truck drivers, and we still expect to see that ramp up again. We've also got sales representatives, linked to manufacturing in here. We do have manufacturing, like first line supervisors of production operating workers. We also have healthcare represented with registered nurses. Maintenance, this is very related to manufacturing as well. As we continually replace people with capital, like those $1 million machines, if one of those goes down and you don't have someone to fix it, that's a ton of lost productivity. And it's actually getting harder and harder to find people with the know-how to fix those kinds of machines. So maintenance is a big one. Teachers are another one. And it is, again, in this case, what you'll see throughout this list here, so this red here is annual growth. These are the jobs that are actually added. And they are dwarfed by transfers, which are just people moving to other occupations, which happens all the time. That's normal churn, but also dwarfed by exits. This right here, this massive number of job openings that we see into the future is all because of people retiring. So again, you see the hit from the baby boomers. We also see skilled trades in here, like carpenters. We see things like farmers, farm managers. There are a lot of jobs throughout a lot of industries mixed in here, and some don't really have a ton of actual growth, like say teachers. You will also find, if we expanded this list, you would find protective services, a lot of other industries like that where there isn't actually a lot of growth, but we're seeing a lot of retirements, and we will have the need to replace those workers. So that's one big piece of what we'll see in the future. Another is kind of based on what happens with COVID. This has been the big wild card, and I have got to say, watching the transcription down below, the different things that is said when I've said COVID have been, again, no, so there we got coming. It blows my mind. But COVID, the pandemic, COVID-19. what, sorry about that. What has happened with this is that everything that we see economically is based on what is happening with the pandemic. Whenever we'd have a surge and people would be more afraid to go out or more afraid to go into stores or more afraid to order out from restaurants, we would see that fairly immediately reflected in how the economy was doing and how the jobs market was. So for most of 2020, everything was COVID. And I can tell you, I will be plenty happy to be done talking about it as well, just kind of like how I felt when I was being an economist during the last recession. It felt like everything was related to the last recession. So, but right now, everything that happens is related to COVID. Now, this will pass, but I can tell you that this map here was from it's from the New York Times, and I just kind of like to watch this one because it tells us how different states are, where they are in terms of how open they are, how their businesses, like the restrictions on them. Most of the country now has very few restrictions, but some of the West Coast where things were surging pretty badly and the Southwest still have, most of their businesses are still relatively closed. And also some of these highly populated East Coast areas. And that's the kind of thing we want to avoid, because it's sort of a balancing act in terms of, obviously we don't want people to get sick, and we want to care about everyone's health, but we also want businesses to stay in business. And my concern for businesses are a lot of these smaller leisure and hospitality ones, bars, restaurants, that they don't have a lot of operating capital to start with. They don't have a lot of a savings, that it becomes very difficult to keep a brick and mortar site like that open when you don't have any income coming in. And that's one of the big wild cards, is that when this is all said and done, we don't really know how many for sure of those businesses will still make it. That said, we know there's been a fair amount of government support for those smaller businesses, with the Paycheck Protection Program and some of that, allowing them to pay and keep their employees and, sort of keep their locations. But what we don't want is a return to what we're seeing here on the West Coast for the whole country. We need to have enough control over how the pandemic is spreading and surging that we can still operate safely. Because again, everything is linked to that perception of safety. Now it comes down to kind of the consumer spending. Consumer spending makes up roughly 70% of the economy. It wasn't always that way, and you can see that consumer spending has risen very significantly since the 1960s. And there was a dip due to COVID here, and it's fairly sizable looking at the trend. But I mean, that didn't even bring us back to, maybe brought us back to 2015 levels of spending, and then we jumped back up. Now it's leveled off some. Again, everything tends to respond to the news about the pandemic and how things are going. But overall, spending is still pretty high, and that's important. If it's 70% of the economy, this is a pretty big deal. But like I said, it's all very linked to whether people feel safe. So that's the whole balancing act of how to keep some businesses open, some restricted. It's a difficult one, and I'm glad I don't make the policy on that. I wouldn't wish for that job. But I can tell you that it's very difficult to keep businesses open and still a level where people feel safe when we have a completely new pandemic that we didn't know a ton about. But everything right now, like I said, is linked to whether people feel safe. So this data is from Franklin Templeton Gallup. They do a lot of polls, and this particular poll was on how confident are you that you can protect yourself when out in public from being infected by the coronavirus? And if you were less than very confident, only 8% had dined outside at a restaurant in the last 24 hours. Very confident, 16%. Dined inside, only 11%. 22% if you were very confident. And it drops more as you go down this list. The difference between the two becomes very evident. Have you booked a flight within 30 days from now? If you were less than very confident, only 9%, 24% if you were very confident. So again, getting everyone into this very confident is how we get people spending. And to get people very confident, we have to make it safe. To make it, and that's the big trick. Whether it's mask wearing, whether it's restricting how many people are in an establishment, again, that's not up to me, but it's a delicate balancing act to keep people safe enough that they'll feel like spending. Because even if we open everything all the way up, if people don't feel safe, they're not going to spend. And that, again, is 70% of the economy. Looking a little more to the future, I can tell you that this event will have a drag on the economy going forward. You can't have something of this magnitude and then expect it to be fixed instantly. That just isn't the way the economy works. It takes a while to rehire people. It takes a while for businesses to ramp up again. It takes a while for people's finances to repair where they feel like they're in a position to spend again. So what I have here for you is, only 3 are labeled. That is unfortunate. I'm not sure how that happened, but this kind of gold line here is the Wisconsin Department of Revenue's latest projections for the future. The red line is from the Federal Reserve Bank. This grayish line is from University of Michigan, RSQE. That's their kind of research branch. And they've been pretty good in general at predictions as well. And this dark blue line, which for whatever reason on this one, the label dropped off, and I will fix that. But this was the Congressional Budget Office. Now they just did a new one in February. And what they're looking at is essentially 2021 having rates somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.7% was where theirs was. And then 5% in 2022. Now, again, if you remember earlier in the presentation for reference, I said that the United States has been hovering more around the mid to high 3s and 4s, depending on what season we're looking at. So that's still relatively high. Some of the other predictors, like Department of Revenue, I mean, they're saying this was just for Wisconsin, but they're saying Wisconsin will be down in the 3s again by 2023, and actually in the low 4s 2022. And even right about at 5% in 2021. So that says that we will see a fair amount of recovery over the coming year. Like a lot of experts kind of think that early 2021 will be a bit slow. And then as the vaccine does its work, we could see a surge in economic growth as people spend more and things, and there's a lot of pent-up demand out there, I think. And I think as things get back to some kind of semblance of normal, we'll see a lot of that demand expressed in spending. Now then after that initial surge, I think things will level off. We should still have, I think, a decent growth year, but again, early on in 2021, I think we'll still see some slowing and weakness. So it's a lot of guesswork as to when we'll see that surge and when we'll see the overall recovery. What I can tell you is that of the 4 different sources that I have listed here, every time throughout this recession that they've revised their projections, the line has moved down on this graph. So what that tells me is that, like, say before, where revenue was maybe projecting 8% in 2021, I can't remember for sure if that's what they projected last time. Now they're saying 5% 2021. The reason for that is after that initial shock to the economy, things actually improved faster and weathered this event better than a lot of economists thought we were going to. And so every time we've been seeing new projections come out as 2021 progressed, they got better. And I think we will still see some drag from this in the coming years. I don't know what impact that'll have on the market necessarily. I can't say for sure what impact that'll have on the economy, just that we will probably see some initial weakness still in 21, followed by a surge, in my opinion. And then we'll level off and maybe stay a little weaker than the past for a while as we work our way back up. That's kind of what most economists expect.
We have a question. Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
What are the sectors for which there is a high demand in the Madison area and in Green Bay area. What kind of talent, skill sets are in high demand in those communities?
Sure. It's a lot of those are, you said Green Bay, and then what was the other one? Or Green Bay and Madison?
Yes, Madison.
Okay, so Green Bay area, very manufacturing oriented. A lot of that area is up there. I think that what we will see in the future is going to be very similar to what we're seeing even right now. And it's going to be a lot of things related to manufacturing. So you'll have, of course, advanced manufacturing positions like, I don't know, machinists, welders, things of that nature, people running those CNC machines. But you will also see truck drivers, warehouse, all of those sort of tertiary businesses that are connected to manufacturing in that way. And I think you'll see other trends that are linked to the statewide trends as well. You'll see healthcare rising. We'll see needs in teachers, protective services. Skilled trades is huge. That's all over the state. These days, if you're trying to get anything built or anything done, you're painfully aware of how few crews there are out there. And I think part of what happened was when we were in the last recession, a lot of kids didn't really go into those skilled trades because they saw people getting laid off left and right, because that one was very related to housing, to the housing market crash. And because of that, whenever you have an event like that, you don't really get a refresh. And then as people retire, you just don't have that talent in the pipeline. And we're always playing a catch-up game after an event like that. So skilled trades, I mean, whether you're talking about carpentry or electricians, plumbers, whether you're a business trying to expand or a homeowner trying to get some work done, it's very difficult right now because there's more demand outstrips supply. And that's another statewide trend. But I would say overall in that sort of Green Bay, Fox Valley, all that area up there, it's very manufacturing focused. Now you see some of that in Madison as well. The other thing though that Madison has a lot more of are tech jobs. And had we expanded that overall statewide list, you would see a lot of IT related jobs on there as well. And again, that's kind of related to, I mean, well, first of all, do you see any business that doesn't have computers in it these days? And those require people to keep them running. They require people to provide customer service and user support, but also to program different kinds of important programs for those businesses, whether you're doing your own in-shop, say, customer resource management program or something like that. So there's a lot of IT, and Madison in particular has a very high cluster in some of those tech positions. So in Madison in particular, I would say that's also very important. I think a lot of it's going to be, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we just have one question from the chat saying that national data says most job loss in lowest wage jobs. In regards to recovery, how are the lower wage jobs recovering? Some of our learners with low literacy work in lower wage fields.
Yeah, sure. I would say that for some of those lower wage jobs, it depends what they were in. Some of the lower wage manufacturing jobs, any place that they were very vulnerable to automation, and I do have a bit on automation here coming up. Some of those lower wage jobs don't always come back. It sort of depends on how the automation works. But sometimes if those lower wage jobs were, say, working at McDonald's, maybe there's the replacement opportunity there with the kiosks, self-ordering kiosks. Or same with retail if more people are shopping online. Now that said, I think a lot of those jobs will return, at least for the time being, just because the initial jump to that technology usually has a cost. Now in automation in general, in COVID, we've seen kind of a massive jump in that. And it's, robots can't spread the pandemic. And so we've seen a trend that was already accelerate even more during the pandemic. But that said, I don't think that means we're going to see all of the retail workers replaced with kiosks or anything like that just yet, if at all, because I think to a certain extent, some of that is intrinsic to the business. Like if you go in a store and you're shopping in a store, you may want to actually talk to some people who work there about the goods that are sold there. So I don't think all low wage jobs will go away, but I do think that some that were lost may not come back, and it will be because of automation, and it will be because of simply smaller businesses that have gone under during the pandemic. Which isn't to say that there won't be new jobs of that nature. I mean, we might see things that we never really anticipated, where it could still be a job that someone with lower skills or a lower aptitude could do. But again, this is a trend we've seen for many years where automation has been replacing some of those jobs. But I mean, we're in kind of the dawn of AI here too. I mean, very few jobs are entirely safe in their current forms. But that said, every time we've seen technological improvement like that, new jobs come along with the manufacturing or with the automation. It's hard to predict what those might be. But that said, I think a fair number of those jobs will still come back, but we'll probably lose some. Okay, yeah, go ahead. And how long do I have here?
I think it ends at 2. So we have about 10 minutes left. There is one more question about interest rates continue to be quite low. How will an increase in interest rates impact the manufacturing sector? Yeah, that was the next question. So I'm not sure how much more you have with your slides. So
I just have
a way to answer that.
Yeah. I just have a couple more, and I'll answer that right off the bat. I don't think that we're going to see much of a rise in interest rates anytime soon. It's possible that if we see enough of a surge in economic growth in 2021, maybe the Fed might raise their rates, which we would then see corresponding rates go up in banking and that sort of thing. But I think that they will be reluctant in 2021, at least, to derail that surge, because they will be concerned more about what happens after. So I don't honestly, this is just my personal opinion, I don't think we're going to see a rate jump anytime in the very near future. That said, obviously if rates went up and it becomes more expensive to borrow, that makes it more difficult to expand, more difficult to take those kinds of risks where you're buying bigger machines or everything of that nature. Lower interest rates tend to help businesses in general. So I think if you're looking at the manufacturing center, yeah, a rate hike would be a bit of an issue, but our rates are right now so historically low that even if they were to raise it in 21, I don't think it would have a huge impact. I think more of the impacts would be based on finding talent or the overall demand for their products. Okay, so some other future trends here that I'll just cover really quickly. So telework, now this one is from the Household Census Pulse Survey, and they actually measure some really interesting things on there, from how many people are teleworking to what their food instability situation is, to the possibility of impending evictions. A lot of things we've heard in this pandemic. That's what this survey was created for. Excuse me. You can see that for telework, Wisconsin was 37.9% of adults lived in a household where at least one substituted in-person work because of the pandemic. This is a trend we expect to stick. Now, if some of your lower wage workers were working in kind of customer service jobs that really didn't necessarily have to be located in a specific site, this will probably be a boon for them. You'll be able to work these jobs from anywhere. And we'd already started to see that with a lot of e-commerce, like you can just log in from home. And that might make things easier for a lot of folks. But I think a lot of jobs will have sort of a telework piece built in going forward. Now, some of those other indicators I mentioned, Wisconsin was actually, we were looking pretty good in terms of things like food instability. Obviously, we produce a lot of food here, and that certainly helped. That said, I mean, there was still an impact. And in terms of impending evictions, we were looking pretty good versus other states there as well. But even here, we were still looking at something in the neighborhood of 25% with an impending eviction. So that's something to keep in mind as well. We might still see those sorts of things impacting the economy and the people who live in our state. Automation. So, I mean, I talked a little bit about this, and again, COVID definitely accelerated this trend. But for every robot butler you see on this other side working in this hotel in California, you still see this robot security guard that takes a unexplained dive into a fountain. So we're not quite there yet on some of these. This particular brand of robot, I think, also rolled over a toddler's foot, and I believe ignored a woman's calls for help. So, I mean, automation is clearly a thing, but it is a lot of this AI and some of that, it isn't quite here yet. Like, you keep hearing about self-driving trucks, and they're being tested in parts of the country, but again, not quite here yet. But this is where these groups are the most vulnerable to automation. Obviously, production, admin support, some of the sales and food prep, material moving, and we already see that. We see robots moving things around Amazon warehouses and stuff like that. But that said, a lot of times these come with different jobs, but they require new skills. So some of the key, I think, to working with those folks who maybe were in lower level jobs and that job disappeared might be in finding them the skills for new positions. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be super, super high skills. We'll just have to keep an eye on what kind of positions are appearing. So I think I'm pretty much out of time. Yeah. Does anyone have any more questions or would like to discuss any more points that we talked about here? Yeah, a lot to take in, I know.
You can put your question in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you.
And I will let you know that I will be on in the next session as well. I won't be actively speaking, but I will be on. And if something that Mari or Bruce says prompts a data question or an economic question, I will be there to talk as well.
Fantastic.
Looks like Randy has a question. I'm going to allow him to talk. I think.
Now I'm unmuted, huh? Can you hear me, Scott?
Yes, I can.
All right. I work in the Department of Corrections, and I'm just kind of wondering how you see the impact of the guys that we have being released with a lot of the programs we're performing.
Are you referring to some of the Ready for Work kind of programs?
Yeah. So like I have you mentioned CNC. I'm getting a CNC lab up here. We got MSSC going, some electromechanical, and a lot of manufacturing type stuff going on. The relationship between corrections and the workforce is one of the things I try to work for, and putting these guys in jobs as soon as they're out. Has that been considered in part of this?
Yeah, it has. I know that the Department of Workforce Development is also working with Department of Corrections a lot on getting some of those released inmates ready and back into the labor force. I can tell you that it's super important for a couple of reasons. First being that we know we don't have much unused capacity in the labor force. So we need every worker we can get. So getting those folks back into the labor force on just strictly from the economic side and the talent side makes a ton of sense. And then we know from data, as I'm sure you know as well, that recidivism rates tend to go down if you're employed, and sort of getting them into that new trend where they're working, they're making money, and transitioning to I guess a more stable life is important on that side, on the person side as well. But yeah, I think that's a great program. I think it's super important coming out with those kinds of skills.
Is DWD trying to help us set up those relationships with manufacturers to make those connections, get those interviews, and when they walk out the door here, they're going right into a job?
Yeah, they are. And I would, when Bruce speaks and Mari in the next session, I would ask them about that too. But DWD actually has job centers in multiple correctional facilities to work very closely with getting them back into the labor force as soon as possible. And I expect to see that program grow in the future because it's very important. I mean, there are so many ripple effects to getting somebody who is incarcerated back into the labor force, both for the good of for them and for society in general and for our businesses that need talent.
Yeah, I'm working on getting one of those centers in here right now.
Great. Which one are you at?
Jackson.
Ah, okay.
So thanks, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super. Well, thank you, Scott, so much for sharing your expertise and for providing us with this wealth of information. If you have any questions, Scott has his information available. You can reach out to him for any follow-up questions. And we just want to thank everyone for attending the Wisconsin State and Regional Economic Trends, sponsored by Wisconsin Literacy. The next training session is local job centers and workforce development boards. It's going to tie real nicely into what we just heard from Scott's presentation, and it will start at 2:30. If you enjoyed this session, join us for the Big Share on March 2nd, a day of online giving that allows Wisconsin Literacy to offer this type of programming. So thank you again for attending. Go grab a cup of coffee and tune into our next session in a few minutes.